many of you, like me, consider themselves data-driven. I think that's one of those buzzwords that you hear a lot in PPC. And today we're going to try and challenge that a bit. How much are we really driven by data, or how much are we just using it when it's convenient? So let's just start with a basic example. Let's say we're bidding on this keyword, and we have, we're doing really well by PPC metrics, conversions, everything's doing really well. And then at some point we notice that no one else is actually bidding on that keyword. And then we also notice that actually our SEO is doing really well, we're ranking first consistently. Do we keep bidding on that keyword when all the metrics are doing so well PPC-wise? I know it's quite rare that we'd have this situation, but let's just take it as an example. Google would probably tell you you should keep bidding all the time, just like they say you should always bid for brand. And there might be reasons why you want to do it, but I think it's the kind of question that I think goes to highlight some of the issues, and it shows why so often the PPC and the SEO teams behave kind of like this, where they're looking at the two different sets of data, they're optimizing in very different ways, even if the behavior they're trying to influence is virtually identical at the end of the day for users, or pretty much identical. But of course, it's not just about PPC and SEO in real life, so there's a lot more channels involved. So maybe it looks more like this, where you've got PPC, SEO, programmatic, paid social, all squabbling over some data. I know the analogy kind of breaks down a little bit here, but bear with me. But okay, so you're probably wondering, this is supposed to be about data and AI, what are we doing talking about how to optimize all these channels? And I'll get into that in just a second, but before we start, can I just see a quick show of hands if you work at an agency? I'll pull quite a few. And in-house? I'll just load a fewer. Cool, and then how many of you would consider your teams data-driven? There we go. Cool, awesome. Actually, I shouldn't say that. Cool, so the reason I ask is because in my experience, even when teams are working really well and they're doing kind of, they're working together really well together, it tends to look a bit more like this, where you've got kind of your team or your agency over there, the data is kind of protected in the back, and then on the other side you've got your client or your boss or your stakeholders or your board or whatever that might be. This isn't always the case, obviously, but I think a lot of times what you find is that data isn't necessarily being used. The idea is that being data-driven isn't the same as just regularly looking at data. I know PPC people, we all love Excel sheets, we love pivot tables, we love reports and data and all this other stuff, but oftentimes that's not necessarily the same as being data-driven. So I'm gonna go out on a limb here and make a bit of a bold claim, but I think that in the majority of cases, PPC teams aren't actually data-driven so much as they're using data to tell the story that they want to tell, rather than chasing the data to see what the story actually is. So let's see what it might actually look like if we were data-driven. Maybe it would look something like this, where you have PPC, SEO, and paid social, and a lot more if we had more dogs in the picture, all looking at the same data and bringing that data back to, in this case, the client or whoever that might be. Sorry, I'm really stretching the animal analogies here, but bear with me. Cool, and so what would this, sorry, before I get to the next part, I'll quickly go through, we're almost ready to start talking about AI. I'll just give you a little bit of background about who I am, just so you can think about how much you want to zone out in the next few minutes. I started off as a PPC account manager over 7 years ago now at Periscopics, that became Merkle, and then that became Dentsu. And within just a few months, I learned to write scripts, and I got really into Google Ads scripts. I kind of fell in love with programming and joined a new team in Merkle that was called the Media Solutions team, and we were building some really awesome kind of automations and data solutions for the teams, for the clients, and it was really cool period of time. We were building. The clients loved us because we were getting results. The team loved us because they were more efficient. We were, winning awards, and we were always putting pitches to wow like prospects. And then COVID happened, and I thought it'd be a good idea to start a business. My family didn't agree, but luckily it was actually a good time, because what we started doing was something that wasn't actually anyone else was doing. And that was essentially to become an outsourced version of that media solutions team, but for smaller and medium-sized agencies that don't necessarily have access to the same resources and can't have those massive teams like the Merkles and the Brain Labs and the big agencies of the world can. And so here's what we're going to do today. We're going to start with, we're going to go through a few different things. We're going to start with the data, because I think that's the first building block to get everything else kind of done. Then, and specifically, we're going to talk about data warehouses, which I think is the really important part of the data thing here. Then we're going to move to machine learning, which is kind of making that data work a little bit harder. And then finally, we're going to end on the fun stuff, which is the AI. Cool. So moving on to the data and essentially why you need a data warehouse. Quick show of hands, how many of you use a data warehouse? Very few, okay. Cool, well hopefully that'll change by the end of this. Basically the idea behind a data warehouse is you pull all of your data from all of your different channels and all of your different sources into one single location. If we want to go back to dodgy metaphors, this would be kind of what your data might look like without a data warehouse. So you can see there's tons of different streams. They're all going every which way. Sometimes they're joining together, sometimes they're splitting apart. Everything's kind of doing its own thing. With a data warehouse, it looks more like this, where all of the streams are flowing into one single big river at the end, and it makes it much easier to build some really cool stuff on top, which we'll talk about in a second. Data warehousing can sound kind of scary, but it really isn't. It's one of those things that nowadays there's tons of tools that make this really, really easy to do, and quite cheap as well, to be honest. So if you want some recommendations, you can ask Jordan or me or Jordan later on, and we'd be happy to share some. But the idea is that it makes it much easier to build cross-channel reports. It makes it much easier to build things at the agency level to see kind of like what's going on overall. And so if we take this example where you've got an agency with 4 clients in there, and you know at the most basic level, you can pull in maybe like a Google Ads ROAS in there. Don't look too much into the numbers. That's not really the point. But basically, this is kind of like a top-level view of what your agency is doing. But now let's say we want to start pulling in, and this is where data warehouses can be really useful, is pulling in things that aren't necessarily part of your regular data. So maybe we want to pull in your time tracking data from Toggle, and maybe we want to add in your project management data from Asana, and maybe you want to pull in, you know, what your revenue from QuickBooks is from those clients. All of a sudden now you've got a lot more data that's pulling through for each of those agencies, for each of those clients. And you can start to create things like a happiness score, for example, of which clients are underserviced, which ones are maybe getting too much time relative to how much revenue they're driving for the business, which ones are taking loads of your time up, and which ones are getting better results. And you can combine all of that. And we've done this actually, and it's been quite useful for a lot of the agencies that we work with. To take an example that's a bit more maybe concrete, I think looking at call tracking data is really useful. So let's take an example where you have a client or a PPC account that's driving leads, and most of the leads that they're looking for are calls, or let's say they're all calls. If you're just tracking those calls back as conversions in Google Ads, you're really not getting the whole picture, right? Because a call that's 10 minutes long is a lot more valuable than one that's 2 minutes long, and a call that's 10 seconds long is a lot less valuable, or probably not valuable at all, to be honest. If you have a data warehouse and you've got your Google Ads data in there, you can start pulling in your call tracking data in there as well. And then you can start building tables that join those things together. And maybe for your campaigns, you can now say how many conversions in CPA you're getting from Google Ads, like you normally would. But you can also start pulling in some basic metrics like call duration. And even that, without doing anything really fancy, you can quite easily build some rules to say like what's actually valuable, what actually isn't. And you can see in this case, for example, if we were looking just at your standard PPC metrics, it might look like your generic campaigns are doing fine, but actually their calls are not that useful. They're all really short calls. Maybe that campaign needs to be completely changed, even if Google Ads would say it's doing great. All right, moving on to machine learning. So now we're going to try and take that data and make it work a little bit harder, do some stuff that's a little bit more interesting. So just following on from the call tracking example, let's keep up with that example, and let's say we now want to use some machine learning with that data. We can do things like, at the most basic level, transcribing the calls, but then even from that, we can use natural language processing where we pass the transcript from a call and start pulling out things like keywords, things like intent, things like concepts. And so all of a sudden, with all of that extra data layered in, you can start answering questions like, are your ads leading mostly to calls that are focusing on low-value services, or are most of your calls actually informational queries that have no real chance of becoming real conversions? And asking all of these things can actually raise some tough questions, because it might look like in Google Ads everything is doing great, or I guess Microsoft Ads is doing great, but actually if we start tying in some of this external data that you might not have pulled in, you find that those campaigns aren't doing anywhere near as well as you thought they were. And so sometimes it can be a little bit jarring, right, and a little bit stressful, because you've want to tell your clients and your team that everything's going great, but it is worth investigating a little further, because ultimately that's what really matters. So if we go on with the natural language processing, we can pull out things like sentiment and emotion. So if we have that same table we had before, now we can pull out things like, were the calls on average positive or negative? What was the main emotion that was in those calls? This isn't exactly how it would work, but it's kind of like the concept of what you can definitely do with numbers, basically. And so now the pattern becomes even more clear that, those generic campaigns, all of those calls are mostly negative. The main emotion is anger. You can start drawing some conclusions like, maybe whoever wrote the ad copy did a really good job of getting on a call, but not really describing what the call would be about. And people are getting on calls and getting angry and essentially being a massive waste of money. And I think the point here is that optimizing PPC accounts with just Google Ads conversion data is essentially like flying a plane with the windows blacked out and just altitude meter working. Like, you can have some control over the plane, but it's going to be hard to take off and land. And I think especially in the environment we're in now, where there's just so much data out there and so much competition, and especially when all of the platforms become more and more a black box where you have less and less control in the first place. I think another really good example of where machine learning can be really useful is for forecasting. I don't know if that's, I remember when I was a PPC account manager, that was one of the most annoying things. There was these constant forecasts that we had to do for those few clients that really wanted them, and it was kind of a thing that you were always doing these forecasts. And I think at a more basic level, everyone was forecasting out very often. If you just look at those budget pacers that take the last 7 days average spend, multiplied by the number of days left in the month, and almost everyone's doing some form of that on a regular basis. But if you've got your data in a data warehouse, you can, and I'm going to use BigQuery as an example here just because it's the best one for marketing agencies or marketing in general. You can do some forecasting directly in the platform. That's really easy to do. So with something as simple as this, pretty much, some really basic SQL, you can essentially start forecasting for all of your metrics on a regular basis for all of your clients and channels, and have that done at a fraction of the time and basically ready in real time. So those budget pacers become a lot more accurate, but it also becomes a lot easier to have them, and it takes a lot less time out of the team doing things that most people don't really want to do, because they can be focused on understanding what that forecast actually means. Another last example with machine learning, this one is the one example that is a little bit more complicated. It does take a little bit more technical expertise, but I think it's worth mentioning because it is interesting. At a really basic level, clustering, again, something you can do directly in BigQuery, is let's say we've got a bunch of keywords, each of these little light bulbs representing a keyword in your account. So you've got 8 keywords in your account. Clustering is when you start trying to find patterns within them of different keywords in this case that behave very similarly. So the idea is, in this case, actually these 3 groups of keywords all behave very similarly. Maybe you can just have 3 keywords in the account instead of 8. Obviously, in an 8 keyword account, that would be completely useless. But if you've got 8,000 keywords, that's where you can start massively reducing overhead by reducing the amount of time that you have to spend on optimizing all of these different keywords. And this is a basic example. Obviously, the idea is doing things with audiences where you're segmenting users into different groups. Cool. So let's finish up with AI and some of the things that you can do here, which I think are probably the most fun. Let's take this as a kind of standard setup. So you've got your Google Ads data with conversions going into CallRail or some other call tracking software, doesn't really matter. And then that data all goes into BigQuery, and your BigQuery data warehouse, and from there you're feeding into some dashboard, Looker Studio, whatever it might be. The way to think about how AI might fit into here is, what if you could take that step and for every single call that you get, pass the transcript to ChatGPT and ask it what happened in that call. Maybe you wanted to ask it to label it as a, I don't know, conversion, cancellation, a new client, a returning client, or maybe you just want to ask it what the theme was, or maybe you want to ask it what products were discussed. All of that ChatGPT is really good at, and there's tools to basically add this into this pipeline, so that you then get into your BigQuery data warehouse, you have your Google Ads data, you have your call tracking data, and then you also have some additional metrics that are pulled out essentially of something like ChatGPT interpreting the call. This kind of thing, this is why I kind of spent so much time on the data, because this is one of the things that's really easy to do once you have this setup set up. Once you have your data warehouse, once you have these pipelines working, adding this ChatGPT step in between, it's not really ChatGPT, but basically, is really easy and incredibly powerful. You can really start to understand better what the actual value that PPC is driving when you're doing this kind of thing. So, for example, if we go back to that table we had before, now we might be, we started off, we just had Google Ads data, conversions, CPA. Then we added in all data from CallRail, for example, looking at the actual time spent. Then we pulled out the sentiment, whether it was positive or negative. And now, using something like ChatGPT, we can look at the actual calls and figure out how many of those actually became bookings. And so now we've gone through all of these different steps where we can get a much better sense for what's actually going on in these PPC campaigns than just what Google's telling you at a very top level. One quick or a couple other examples of what you can do with AI once you have all this data set up is things like writing commentary. I know that used to take loads of time for me, and sometimes there's some use to it, but I think a lot of the time it was just kind of going through the motions of copy pasting kind of some numbers and writing some commentary based on what's going on. I've seen a few things floating around my LinkedIn feeds where they say download this data, put it into ChatGPT with this prompt, and you get like some commentary out, and that'll save you some time. But like with all of these things, if you have everything in a data warehouse and you've connected it all up, you can have this being done constantly for all of your clients, for all of your channels, and have it already linked to, say, your Looker Studio dashboards. Obviously, you want to double check some of these things, and there's some value to building commentary, but just as an example of what's possible, once you have all that set up, you can automate most of this completely. And I think that's why, when it comes to AI, you hear a lot about, using AI to make it easier to do some keyword research or to write ad copy. But ultimately, that's not really saving huge amounts of time, and it's not anywhere near as powerful, at least in my opinion, as getting down to like finding out exactly what the value is that PPC is actually driving. Leading on from this commentary example, and I think this is kind of one of the most exciting things that you can start to think about, is imagine you had a version of ChatGPT that already knew everything about all of your clients, all of your accounts, all of your platforms. It had all that data there, and it basically became your personal assistant when it came to marketing data. So this is already possible to some extent. It's one of the more expensive and complicated things, but we have set this up for someone that we work for, a client that we work with. But it's definitely going to become more and more accessible in the next few months or years potentially. And having that data already set up in that foundation in a data warehouse, or at least consolidated in some way, makes it really easy to start taking advantage of these kinds of tools once they start coming out. And I think this could be, pretty revolutionary in terms of the amount of how fast you could troubleshoot things, how fast you could find insights, different things to experiment with, different tests to try. There's just loads of stuff that's possible there when you have something that can have access to all of your data at the same time. So finishing up, going back to the cute dogs. I've given a lot of examples. I'll stop with that for now. But if I could just leave you with one thing, it would be really think about being data-driven, and how just using data on a regular basis isn't necessarily the same thing as following the data and seeing where it leads. I think really leveraging and embracing the AI tools that are available now and the ones that are on the horizon really requires a solid foundation of data. So I guess when you go back to work tomorrow, challenge yourselves. What data practices, how can I strengthen my data practices to really take advantage and meet our strategic goals when it comes to AI? And yeah, I think that's pretty much it.